Hi there, and welcome to Coup English. In this series, we explore the lives of amazing people and help you improve your English at the same time. Ready? Let's dive in. The Architect of Thinking Machines, The Life of Marvin Minsky. Chapter 1. Childhood in a Curious Household. In the quiet suburban corners of New York City during the early 1930s, a boy named Marvin Minsky was born into a world that pulsed with curiosity and invention. Born on August 9, 1927, Marvin grew up in a family where ideas were as common as mealtime conversation. His father, Henry Minsky, was a well-respected ophthalmologist, and his mother, Fanny Reiser Minsky, was a Zionist activist and social worker. Their home was filled not only with books, but with a sense of questioning and wonder. There was a piano in the corner, a microscope in the study, and often a heated debate about politics or science at the dinner table. Marvin was a quiet child, but one whose eyes always seemed to search for the hidden mechanisms behind everything. When he played with toys, he didn't simply use them. He took them apart, examined the springs and gears, and sometimes rebuilt them to do things they weren't meant to do. His mind didn't settle for surface impressions. He needed to understand the inner workings, the invisible hands behind movement and form. One of his earliest fascinations was with light. At 6, Marvin would spend hours by the window, shifting prisms to scatter rainbows across the walls, wondering why colors bent and danced. His father noticed this obsession and gifted him a chemistry set and later a small telescope. These simple tools opened infinite doors. The night sky was no longer just a black canvas dotted with stars to Marvin. It was a machine of celestial logic, something waiting to be understood. The Minksys were Jewish, and although they were not deeply religious, the culture of learning and questioning that runs deep in Jewish tradition found a strong echo in Marvin's upbringing. Stories from Jewish folklore and ethics, which valued wisdom and debate, deeply influenced him. This household nurtured not only intelligence but independence of thought. Marvin learned that it was not only okay to ask why, it was essential. Formal education bored him early on. He found most classroom lessons either too slow or too shallow. Yet, he remained polite, rarely challenging teachers in public. Instead, he would return home, open his own books, and dig deeper. His parents never forced him into particular subjects but supported his growing interest in mathematics, physics, and mechanics. Their greatest gift, perhaps, was freedom, the freedom to explore. When Marvin turned 9, his father took him to a lecture on the human eye. It wasn't meant to be extraordinary, just a quiet evening out. But the lecture sparked something profound. As he listened to the descriptions of rods, cones, and the retina, Marvin began to wonder, could machines see? Could they think? It would be years before these questions became scientific pursuits, but the seeds were already there. Summer vacations were not spent at beaches or theme parks. Marvin preferred science camps or retreats in the countryside where he could gather insects, analyze rocks, or build small gadgets out of scraps. One summer, he built a rudimentary radio from spare parts and proudly showed it off to neighbors. The contraption didn't always work, but it was a sign. Marvin wasn't content with following instructions. He wanted to invent. But this intense curiosity came with a sense of isolation. While other boys were interested in sports or games, Marvin was lost in books or tangled in wires. He didn't mind. He once said that solitude was a necessary part of thought. He had imaginary conversations with famous scientists, wrote little theories in the margins of his notebooks, and tried to imagine what minds might look like if they could be mapped. Family life wasn't without its tensions. His mother, strong-willed and politically active, sometimes clashed with his father's more quiet, intellectual temperament, but Marvin seemed to absorb the best of both. From his mother, he inherited a fire for ideas and social justice. From his father, he inherited precision, focus, and a love of detail. This duality would later shape his unique approach to artificial intelligence, balancing logic with imagination. Looking back, Marvin often described his childhood as fortunate, not because it was easy, but because it gave him the perfect soil to grow. He once said, "My parents didn't teach me what to think. They let me think." By the time he entered adolescence, Marvin Minsky was already far ahead of most of his peers. He had built his own laboratory in the basement, filled with tools, circuit boards, and books stacked floor to ceiling. He began writing short treatises on the human brain, designing simple machines that could mimic basic reactions, and dabbling in mathematics that many adults would struggle to understand. But even as he became more knowledgeable, Marvin never lost his childlike sense of wonder. He believed that mystery was not something to be feared, but explored. And in this early phase of life, everything was a mystery, waiting to be solved. The foundation had been laid. The boy who played with prisms and imagined machines that could think was beginning to grow into the man who would change the world. Chapter 2: Seeds of Genius, School Days, and First Inventions. As Marvin Minsky stepped into the halls of the ethical culture Fieldston School in New York City, he carried with him not just books and notebooks, but a mind already dancing with unasked questions. This school, known for its progressive educational values, was a good fit for Marvin's inquisitive spirit. Still, it struggled to keep up with him. Teachers were quick to notice his sharp intellect. He answered questions that hadn't been asked, and often made connections between subjects that left others scrambling to follow. But Marvin was not arrogant. He simply saw the world through a more complex lens. He once told a classmate, "Everything is connected. You just have to look long enough." One of his early obsessions was mathematics. Numbers fascinated him, not for their rigidity, but for their hidden elegance. He would spend hours solving problems far beyond his grade level, sometimes creating his own challenges just to satisfy his curiosity. Geometry was particularly enchanting. The logic, the space, the clean perfection of shapes. It all appealed to his precise and imaginative nature. His first inventions emerged during this time, not yet grand machines, but clever devices cobbled together from wire, glass, and scraps salvaged from junkyards. One of his early creations was a mechanical alarm clock that not only rang at the designated time, but also played music from a radio and opened the window. Shutters, a gentle way to wake up, as he described it. He was barely 13. Marvin's schoolwork often took a back seat to his own explorations. He devoured scientific journals, built primitive computers from relays and batteries, and conducted small chemistry experiments in his basement laboratory. His parents didn't mind. They understood that Marvin was learning more through his experiments than he could ever gather from textbooks. His social life remained limited, but not empty. He had a few close friends, mostly fellow science enthusiasts, and enjoyed deep, thoughtful conversations rather than idle chatter. What set him apart wasn't just his intellect, but his ability to see problems from multiple angles. He was already thinking like a scientist. Around age 15, Marvin stumbled upon a copy of Alan Turing's groundbreaking paper on computable numbers and the idea of a universal machine. Though dense and theoretical, the paper thrilled him. It offered a vision of how machines might replicate thought, a question that had lingered in Marvin's mind since childhood. He read the paper repeatedly, marking the margins with questions and exclamation points. Music, too, played an important role in Marvin's school years. He studied classical piano, and although he never pursued it professionally, he believed music shaped his thinking. To Marvin, music and mathematics were siblings, both abstract, both beautiful, both rooted in pattern and emotion. In high school, Marvin's talents truly began to attract attention. He won regional science fairs, submitted articles to academic journals, and started to build a local reputation as a young genius. But he remained humble, driven more by fascination than fame. It was during these formative years that Marvin began formulating ideas about intelligence itself. Why did humans think the way they did? Could thinking be reduced to patterns? Was creativity a form of computation? These questions buzzed in his brain late at night, sometimes keeping him awake with excitement. He began keeping notebooks filled with theories, diagrams, and philosophical ponderings, some of which would later influence his academic writings. A pivotal moment came when a local university professor, having read one of Marvin's early essays, invited him to attend a series of lectures on neuroscience and machine logic. Though he was still a teenager, Marvin attended every session with wide eyes and a quick pen. He spoke little, but absorbed everything. His questions after the lectures often stunned the speakers, complex, multi-layered, and well beyond his age. At home, his experiments became bolder. He rigged a typewriter to respond to voice commands, using rudimentary sound sensors and mechanical linkages. The machine wasn't reliable, but it was a stunning achievement for a teenager in the 1940s. His parents marveled at the device, but were not surprised. "That's just Marvin," they would say. Despite his brilliance, Marvin wasn't immune to self-doubt. He often worried whether his ideas were too wild or whether he would ever be taken seriously. He read biographies of great scientists and philosophers, searching not just for inspiration, but for reassurance that even the most influential minds had once been misunderstood. As he neared graduation, one thing was clear. Marvin Minsky was not meant for an ordinary path. His teachers encouraged him to apply to the most prestigious universities. His parents, though supportive, made only one request: never stop being curious. In the final weeks of high school, Marvin built what he called his thinking box, a device meant to mimic simple decision-making processes. It used switches, relays, and conditional circuits to make basic choices, like selecting a path based on light or sound. Primitive by today's standards, it was groundbreaking at the time, and even more importantly, it reflected the core question that would guide Marvin for decades to come. What does it mean to think? When Marvin received his acceptance letter from Harvard University, he didn't jump with joy. Instead, he quietly returned to his lab and began sketching out his next invention. Chapter 3: War, Academia, and the Mind's Machinery. When Marvin Minsky stepped onto the campus of Harvard University in the fall of 1944, he did so with quiet determination. The world was in the throes of World War II, and the atmosphere, even at a prestigious Ivy League school, was tinged with uncertainty. For Marvin, though, this was not a time of fear, it was a time of opportunity. Harvard, with its sprawling libraries, state-of-the-art laboratories, and faculty of renowned scholars, was a playground for his intellect. He enrolled in mathematics, but his interests ranged far beyond formulas and equations. He dabbled in biology, philosophy, and psychology, hunting for clues to a question that had haunted him since childhood: how does the mind work? Marvin wasn't a traditional student. While his peers stuck to assigned readings, he wandered the library stacks for obscure volumes, reading Descartes, Leibniz, Gödel, and then shifting to the latest research in neurology and electrical engineering. He moved easily between disciplines, convinced that understanding intelligence required knowledge from every field. Professors soon recognized his talent and his unconventional methods. The war effort loomed in the background, and though Marvin was drafted, his academic brilliance led to a deferment that allowed him to contribute through research. He participated in military-related projects involving signal processing and cryptographic systems, sharpening his skills in logic, systems theory, and machine behavior. It was here that he gained hands-on experience with some of the earliest computing machines, sparking a deeper fascination with their potential. One of his favorite places at Harvard was the Computation Laboratory, where the early Harvard Mark I computer resided. Though large and cumbersome, it was a marvel of engineering, filled with relays, gears, and vacuum tubes. Marvin often observed its operation, not just as a technician or student, but as a philosopher. What did it mean for a machine to process information? Was it truly thinking, or merely executing instructions without understanding? Outside the lab, Marvin remained intensely curious about the brain. He began auditing neuroscience courses and visiting nearby hospitals to watch brain surgery and neurology exams. He kept detailed notes, sketching diagrams of neurons and speculating on how electrical signals might become thoughts. He wondered if intelligence was simply the result of many small parts working in harmony, like switches in a circuit. In 1948, Marvin graduated summa cum laude with a degree in mathematics, but his journey was far from over. Encouraged by mentors and driven by insatiable curiosity, he applied to Princeton for graduate study. It was a natural progression. Princeton was home to some of the greatest mathematical minds of the century, including John von Neumann and Kurt Gödel, both of whom had influenced Marvin's thinking through their writings. At Princeton, Marvin encountered an intellectual atmosphere that both challenged and excited him. He met like-minded students and faculty who were also exploring the intersections between mathematics, physics, and cognition. It was during this period that he first began using the term artificial intelligence in his discussions, though the field had not yet taken formal shape. His doctoral work blended mathematics, logic, and neurology in ways few had attempted. He studied neural networks, not yet popular or well understood at the time, and tried to create theoretical models of how brains might be simulated through machines. His dissertation advisor once remarked that Marvin was thinking decades ahead. In the basement of Princeton's labs, Marvin built what he called the SNARC stochastic neural analog reinforcement calculator. It was one of the first artificial neural network machines designed to mimic the behavior of a rat navigating a maze. Using tubes, relays, and analog components, SNARC could learn from trial and error. It was primitive, clunky, and noisy, but it worked. More importantly, it represented Marvin's first real step into the world he would help define: artificial intelligence. The construction of SNARC wasn't glamorous. It involved long nights soldering wires, testing circuits, and debugging by flashlight. But Marvin thrived in this setting. He wasn't interested in sleek appearances. He wanted functionality. He wanted to understand. During this time, Marvin also began writing essays that explored the philosophical implications of machine intelligence. Could machines have creativity? Could they develop goals or preferences? Were emotions necessary for thought? These questions, once the realm of philosophers, were now being examined through circuits and code. Though still in his 20s, Marvin was already beginning to establish himself as a unique voice in both the scientific and philosophical communities. He wasn't afraid to challenge dogma or venture into speculative territory. His ideas attracted a mix of admiration and skepticism. Yet Marvin was never discouraged by resistance. He saw skepticism as a sign that he was on the right path, exploring something new, something uncomfortable. He believed deeply that intelligence, whether human or artificial, was not a mystery to be feared but a phenomenon to be studied, modeled, and ultimately replicated. By the time he completed his PhD in 1954, Marvin Minsky had already done what many spend a lifetime attempting. He had carved out a new area of inquiry, one foot in the world of theoretical math, the other in the burgeoning field of computing, and both eyes firmly fixed on the mystery of the mind. He was ready to build machines that think. Chapter 4. Building Minds at MIT. Cambridge, Massachusetts, with its brisk air and red brick buildings, welcomed Marvin Minsky in the mid-1950s as he stepped into a new chapter of his life. Having just earned his PhD from Princeton, he was full of ideas and searching for a place where imagination could meet innovation. The Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, was that place. At the time, it was already a hub for engineering and scientific breakthroughs. But what Marvin had in mind was something more radical. He joined MIT's Lincoln Laboratory initially to continue his work on neural networks and computing systems. But soon, his vision outgrew the constraints of existing departments. Machines, he believed, were not just tools. They could evolve into collaborators, thinkers, maybe even something like friends. This idea was bold, even outrageous to some, but it stirred the minds of a few pioneers who believed in possibility over tradition. In 1959, along with fellow visionary John McCarthy, Marvin co-founded the Artificial Intelligence Group at MIT. The very act of naming it, artificial intelligence, was a statement. It declared a new field, one that had no textbook, no rulebook, only ambition and curiosity. They set up their laboratory in a modest corner of campus, filled with spare equipment, chalkboards full of diagrams, and the persistent scent of solder and burning circuits. Marvin's leadership was unique. He didn't manage with strict rules or formal hierarchy. Instead, he fostered a space of open inquiry, encouraging students to challenge assumptions and build things just to see if they would work. "Try it and see," was his usual answer when someone asked whether an idea was possible. One of the early projects that defined the lab was the development of a robotic hand and vision system, at a time when most computers filled entire rooms and had limited processing power. The idea of a machine that could see and manipulate objects was far-fetched. But under Marvin's guidance, the project pressed forward. He didn't expect perfection, he expected progress. Students loved working with him. He was intellectually demanding but never condescending. He had a gift for making complexity feel approachable, using metaphors and stories to explain concepts that others would bury under jargon. He would sit cross-legged on a desk, sketching diagrams while discussing the possibility of consciousness in machines. To Marvin, learning was an adventure, and teaching was a form of shared discovery. Outside of the lab, Marvin began writing what would become some of the foundational texts in artificial intelligence. His essays often explored the relationship between the mind and machines, raising questions about memory, creativity, and learning. These writings didn't just propose ideas, they built frameworks for how to think about thinking itself. Meanwhile, the AI group at MIT began attracting attention from both the academic world and government agencies. Funding increased, more students applied, and the lab expanded. What had begun as a speculative venture was becoming a respected field. Marvin's colleagues respected him not only for his intellect, but for his vision. He was the kind of thinker who could see 10 steps ahead, imagining futures that others considered science fiction. At the same time, he was always ready to return to the soldering bench and fix a malfunctioning circuit himself. During this period, Marvin also collaborated with researchers in other disciplines: linguistics, psychology, philosophy. He believed that understanding intelligence required perspectives from every possible angle. To build minds, one had to study them deeply in all their biological, logical, and emotional layers. By the mid-1960s, the field of artificial intelligence was gaining momentum, and Marvin Minsky stood at its epicenter. His students were winning awards, his lab was producing groundbreaking work, and his ideas were influencing a generation of thinkers. But even as recognition grew, Marvin remained focused on the questions, not the accolades. He didn't want fame, he wanted understanding. He often reminded his team that what they were doing was not about creating gadgets, it was about exploring what it meant to be intelligent. One of the defining characteristics of Marvin's work at MIT was his belief in the complexity of the mind. He rejected simplistic models. To him, intelligence was not a single ability, but a vast, interconnected network of processes. Later, he would formalize this belief in his Society of Mind theory. But even in these early years, the seeds of that idea were taking root. Marvin's days at MIT were long, often stretching past midnight. He didn't separate life from work because to him, the two were intertwined. Ideas came at any hour, and he welcomed them. His office was filled with half-finished machines, stacks of papers, and walls covered in chalk scrolls. It wasn't neat, but it was alive with thought. Despite the challenges, technical limitations, skepticism from the broader academic community, and frequent failures, Marvin never wavered. He believed that, with enough time and enough minds working together, artificial intelligence would not only be possible, it would be transformative. As the 1960s came to a close, Marvin Minsky had established himself not just as a brilliant scientist, but as the heart of a movement. The lab he helped build was no longer a corner project. It was a beacon for those who believed in thinking machines. And Marvin, with his unrelenting curiosity and generous spirit, had become a guide for all who dared to follow. Copyright notice. Cool English channel. All rights reserved. This video and its content are protected by copyright law. Unauthorized copying, redistribution, re-uploading, or modification of this content is strictly prohibited and may result in legal action. Respect the creator. Do not steal. Chapter 5. The Birth of Artificial Intelligence. By the dawn of the 1970s, Marvin Minsky's work had taken on a new energy. The ideas that had once been seen as speculative were now gaining traction. Across the globe, researchers were beginning to treat artificial intelligence as a legitimate scientific discipline. But for Marvin, the work was not about being proven right, it was about pushing boundaries. MIT's AI lab was his workshop. his classroom, and his sanctuary. And at its heart was a question that never left him: how can we build a mind? In these years, Marvin's vision evolved. He became less interested in mimicking intelligence and more concerned with modeling its underlying architecture. His thinking grew more philosophical. He began to speak of minds not as singular entities, but as communities, systems of systems. And slowly, this new conceptual framework started to form. During late-night brainstorming sessions, surrounded by students and whiteboards filled with chaotic scribbles, Marvin articulated a theory that would shape the future of AI, the society of mind. This idea proposed that the mind was not a single, unified processor, but a network of agents, small, simple processes that interacted to produce what we recognize as thought, behavior, and emotion. Each agent had a function, and together they created the illusion of a coherent self. This theory was revolutionary. It went beyond the binary logic of early AI, inviting researchers to think about modularity, emergence, and complexity. It allowed for contradiction and ambiguity, qualities that mirrored human cognition far more than neat algorithms. While many still clung to the dream of a master algorithm, a singular solution to intelligence, Marvin insisted that complexity was the key. At the same time, the lab continued its practical work. Students built early language processors, attempted machine vision projects, and experimented with robotic movement. Some of these projects failed. Others led to incremental improvements. But the real breakthrough was in mindset. AI was no longer science fiction. It was science, driven by theory and built by hands-on engineering. In 1969, Marvin co-authored a book with Seymour Papert titled Perceptrons. It was a technical exploration of the limits and capabilities of neural networks, systems inspired by the structure of the brain. The book was controversial. It pointed out significant flaws in simple neural networks and suggested that they had limited potential unless expanded with additional layers and logic. Critics later blamed the book for slowing research in neural nets, but Marvin's intention was never to discourage. He simply demanded rigor and clarity. The book also highlighted Marvin's deep respect for collaboration. Seymour Papert, a brilliant mathematician and education theorist, had become one of Marvin's closest intellectual partners. Together, they worked not only on AI, but also on education, technology. They believed children could learn in powerful new ways if given access to tools that encouraged exploration and creativity. This belief led to the development of Logo, a programming language for children, and early computer-based learning systems. Marvin's interests ranged far and wide. He wrote papers on vision, memory, learning, and even consciousness. His style was unusual, more narrative than formulaic, but deeply insightful. He used analogies, storytelling, and metaphor to explore technical ideas, making them accessible to a wider audience. As artificial intelligence started to attract attention from the media and government, Marvin became a reluctant spokesperson for the field. He appeared in interviews, gave public talks, and even advised organizations like DARPA and NASA. Still, he remained a teacher first. The lab at MIT was his anchor. There, he mentored students, not just in science, but in how to think. He urged them to ask better questions, to remain skeptical, to test their ideas in the real world. He was known for pushing students hard, not out of ego, but because he believed in their potential. And when they succeeded, he celebrated with the joy of a proud parent. Not everyone agreed with Marvin's views. The AI community was becoming more divided. Some researchers focused on logical systems and expert rules, while others pursued neural networks or genetic algorithms. Marvin welcomed the diversity, but held firm to his belief that true intelligence required embracing complexity. He once said, "No simple thing can explain a complicated one. That's the whole point." At home, Marvin was as curious as he was in the lab. He filled his house with strange gadgets, musical instruments, and prototypes. He was a loving husband and a devoted father, and he often shared his work with his children in the form of stories or puzzles. Intelligence, to Marvin, was a family affair. By the late 1970s, artificial intelligence had grown from a fringe idea into a global field, with conferences, journals, and academic departments. Marvin Minsky, had helped spark this revolution. But he remained restless. He didn't want to merely replicate human intelligence. He wanted to understand it, to dissect it, to improve upon it. The birth of AI was not a single moment, but a series of insights, experiments, and bold declarations. Marvin had been present at each stage, sometimes ahead of the curve, sometimes battling setbacks, but always asking the most important question: what makes us think? Chapter 6. A Mind at Play. Inventions and Collaborations. To Marvin Minsky, the boundaries between work and play were not clearly drawn. He saw creativity not as a separate pursuit, but as the engine behind both invention and understanding. As the field of artificial intelligence matured in the 1980s, Marvin remained an explorer, moving between projects with the energy of someone discovering the world anew each day. For him, invention was an act of joy, and collaboration was its natural companion. The AI lab at MIT continued to serve as Marvin's base, but his ideas and influence extended far beyond its walls. During this period, he worked closely with colleagues from across disciplines: linguists, computer scientists, musicians, and artists. He believed that creativity in one field could ignite breakthroughs in another. His collaborations were not always formal. Some began over dinner, others during hallway conversations that sparked ideas too compelling to ignore. One such collaboration was with composer Todd Makova from the MIT Media Lab. Marvin was fascinated by the emotional power of music and its ability to represent complex inner states. He saw potential in using music to teach machines about human feelings or even to simulate those emotions themselves. These conversations contributed to early work in effective computing, an area that would gain more recognition decades later. Another key partnership was with Seymour Papert, which deepened as they turned their attention to education. Together, they promoted the idea that learning should be exploratory, not dictated. They created educational software that allowed children to guide their own experiences, a reflection of Marvin's own belief that curiosity was the greatest teacher. Logo, their programming language for children, empowered students to manipulate geometric figures and think algorithmically from a young age. At the heart of Marvin's work during this time was a belief in intellectual play. He filled notebooks with sketches of machines that might draw, paint, or tell jokes. He entertained thought experiments. What if a machine misunderstood instructions like a child might? Could that confusion lead to new forms of intelligence? His colleagues sometimes saw his brainstorming sessions as chaotic, but there was always method in the madness. He welcomed wild ideas because they had the potential to reveal truths that cautious logic could not reach. If it seems silly, he often said, it might be brilliant. During this period, Marvin also became more involved with the MIT Media Lab, which was founded in 1985. He saw it as a space where the boundaries between art, science, and technology were deliberately blurred. He championed projects that combined storytelling with computation and imagination with engineering. His influence shaped the lab's playful, experimental ethos. Outside of MIT, Marvin served as an advisor to numerous organizations, from startups to government agencies. People sought his insight, not just because he was a pioneer, but because he brought a humanistic lens to technology. He could discuss machine learning one moment and shift seamlessly to discussing cognitive psychology or ethics the next. He also began to appear more frequently in the public eye, interviews, documentaries, and conferences, where his deep, deliberate voice often delivered complex ideas in simple, visual metaphors. One moment he might describe the brain as a meat machine, and the next, compare emotions to software overlays running atop old neural hardware. These metaphors stuck with people. But Marvin's public persona was never about self-promotion. He preferred small gatherings to large stages, meaningful conversation to fame. When asked about the growing interest in AI, he would often redirect the question, asking instead, what kind of intelligence do we want to create? It was never just about capability, it was about purpose. In 1986, Marvin published The Society of Mind, a book that brought together decades of thinking, written in a unique format. Part prose, part theory, part thought experiment. It proposed that intelligence arises from the interaction of many smaller agents within the brain. Each agent was simple on its own, but when organized in the right way, they could give rise to perception, memory, language, and even consciousness. The book was unlike anything in the field. It didn't follow a traditional academic structure. Instead, it read like a philosophical journey, an invitation to think differently about thinking. It became essential reading for students of AI, cognitive science, and philosophy alike. Marvin was often asked if he believed machines would one day surpass human intelligence. His answers varied. Sometimes he said yes. Sometimes he said it depended on how we define intelligence. But always, he emphasized that our goal should not be replication, but understanding. If machines could help us better understand ourselves, that would be the greatest achievement of all. During these years, Marvin's inventions became more conceptual than mechanical. He wasn't trying to build the fastest computer or the most advanced robot. Instead, he was building frameworks, ways of seeing the world that could shape how others thought and created. His gift was not just insight, but influence. Yet, even with decades of innovation behind him, Marvin never stopped asking questions. Why do we forget? Why do we dream? Can a machine be confused? Can it learn from that confusion? To him, these were not idle curiosities. They were the foundations of future exploration. As the 1980s drew to a close, Marvin Minsky stood not only as a founder of artificial intelligence, but as a thinker who reminded the world that progress comes from play, that brilliance can be found in mistakes, and that sometimes the most powerful invention is an idea. Chapter 7: The Philosopher of Machines. By the early 1990s, Marvin Minsky was not just seen as a scientist, but increasingly as a philosopher, a thinker whose work ventured beyond the realm of machines and into the heart of what it meant to be human. His questions no longer stopped at, can a machine think, but moved deeper into territory like, what is thinking, and why do minds behave the way they do? This phase of his life was marked by greater introspection and an expanding vision. Though still grounded at MIT, Marvin's curiosity led him into less trodden intellectual paths. He began speaking more openly about consciousness, emotions, and creativity, not only as human traits, but as phenomena that might someday be modeled or mirrored by machines. To some, these ideas seemed fantastical, even hubristic. To Marvin, they were essential. He liked to remind people that intelligence didn't emerge from a single grand structure. It arose from the interactions of simple components. This belief, rooted in his Society of Mind theory, evolved into new thoughts that would later be captured in his unfinished work, The Emotion Machine. Here, Marvin argued that emotions were not irrational glitches in human reasoning, but adaptive tools the mind used to evaluate complex situations. He proposed that machines, too, would need emotions, or something like them, if they were to make sense of ambiguous inputs and shifting contexts. Marvin's writing during this time became increasingly layered. He borrowed freely from psychology, literature, and philosophy. He quoted Shakespeare as easily as he cited neuroscience studies. This intellectual cross-pollination made his work dense, but also richly rewarding. He was not merely explaining how machines might work. He was offering new metaphors for understanding ourselves. In classrooms and lectures, Marvin still held his audience in a kind of quiet awe. His presence was both gentle and formidable. Students came away from his talks feeling as though they had peeked behind a curtain most people didn't know existed. He rarely answered questions directly. Instead, he asked better ones. When a student asked, "Can machines have free will?" he responded, "Do you think you do?" His teaching style was Socratic. He guided students through a landscape of ideas rather than delivering fixed answers. For those who expected linear instruction, this could be frustrating, but for the curious, it was transformative. Many of his students went on to become pioneers in AI themselves, each carrying a piece of Marvin's philosophical DNA into their work. Outside academia, Marvin's ideas found their way into broader cultural conversations. As movies like The Matrix and AI Artificial Intelligence captured public attention, journalists and filmmakers turned to Marvin for insight. He approached these requests with a mix of amusement and seriousness. He loved fiction that stretched the imagination, but he was careful to distinguish fantasy from genuine possibility. He was particularly critical of AI doomsayers, those who warned of machines becoming malevolent overlords. The problem isn't that machines will become too intelligent, he once said. The problem is that they'll be too stupid and yet still do damage because we give them power we don't understand. It was a characteristically Minskyan answer, wry, incisive, and grounded in reality. Though never one to seek attention, Marvin did value recognition when it came from thoughtful places. He received numerous awards, including the Japan Prize and the Benjamin Franklin Medal. But what mattered more to him were the people who approached him with ideas sparked by his own. Whether it was a grad student with a sketchy neural model or a musician with a theory about pattern recognition, Marvin welcomed anyone whose curiosity burned brightly. Privately, Marvin was just as inquisitive. He read voraciously, played classical piano, and built mechanical gadgets for no reason other than joy. He was fascinated by illusions, visual, cognitive, or otherwise. He saw the brain as the greatest illusionist of all, tricking us into believing in continuity, selfhood, even rationality. He delighted in puzzles and paradoxes, seeing them as tools to stretch the mind beyond its habits. His home, like his mind, was filled with odd and delightful objects. A self-playing musical box, books stacked 2 rows deep, a mechanical drawing arm he had built in the 1960s. These weren't trophies, they were testaments to a life spent turning thought into form. In discussions of legacy, Marvin was reluctant. He disliked the finality of the word. Legacy, he said once, is just another word for unfinished. Still, he knew he had changed things, not just by inventing or theorizing, but by questioning in a way that compelled others to do the same. By the end of the 1990s, Marvin Minsky had become something rare, a bridge between eras. He had been present at the birth of artificial intelligence and was still asking bold questions as the 21st century dawned. His role had shifted from that of a builder to a sage, but his core remained unchanged. He still believed, as he always had, that the universe was knowable and that intelligence, whether human or machine, was our best way of exploring it. And he continued to explore, not just through wires and code, but through philosophy, conversation, and play. For Marvin, thought was the greatest playground, and the future was always a game worth playing. Chapter 8. The Teacher Who Inspired Generations. Marvin Minsky never thought of himself primarily as a teacher, but few could deny the immense influence he had on those lucky enough to learn under him. His classroom at MIT was a strange, magical place where logic danced with imagination, and rules were often more like suggestions. He didn't deliver knowledge, he unearthed curiosity. Students often said walking into his lab felt like entering a dream of the future. There were robots half-assembled on workbenches, whiteboards scribbled with equations and doodles, and the feeling that anything was possible if only one asked the right question. Marvin welcomed people into this space not with formality, but with a kind of warm challenge. So, what have you been wondering lately? His way of teaching defied traditional models. He rarely assigned specific tasks or imposed rigid schedules. Instead, he encouraged projects that bordered on the impossible. If a student had a wild idea, something so big and strange that most professors would roll their eyes, Marvin would lean forward, smile slightly, and say, "Try it." He believed failure wasn't a setback, but a vital part of intellectual adventure. Among his most notable students were individuals who later became leading figures in artificial intelligence and computer science. Danny Hillis, a visionary computer scientist, once remarked that Marvin didn't just teach him how to build machines, he taught him how to think. For Marvin, teaching wasn't about transferring information. It was about reshaping the way minds approached the world. He often mixed abstract thought with playful creativity. Once, to explain a complex idea about recursive systems, Marvin pulled out a set of Russian nesting dolls. Each layer, he said, is a kind of mind that understands the layer beneath it, but not quite itself. He made serious concepts memorable through humor and metaphor. often dipping into surreal analogies. This made him a legend among his students, not because he made things easier, but because he made them irresistible. Beyond the walls of MIT, Marvin gave countless talks around the world. He spoke at universities, tech companies, art forums, and even science fiction conventions. His talks were rarely rehearsed, often wandering, and always stimulating. He could move from brain chemistry to Gödel's incompleteness theorem to the behavior of ants, all in one breath. People followed not just to learn facts, but to ride the roller coaster of his thought. Minsky was also a strong advocate for education reform. He believed that traditional schooling often dampened creativity rather than nurturing it. He was frustrated by standardized tests, fixed curricula, and systems that rewarded conformity. He once wrote, "We spend too much time teaching students what to think, and not enough time teaching them how to think." His own children, Henry, Margaret, and Juliana, grew up in a home where learning was embedded in daily life. The lines between play, work, and education were blurred. Dinner conversations often turned into impromptu lectures or debates. Marvin would ask his kids why shadows move or how memory might work in a machine. These were not quizzes, they were invitations. Marvin's mentorship wasn't limited by age or status. He took time to speak with high schoolers, curious artists, and amateur inventors. If you had an idea, Marvin wanted to hear it. His encouragement sparked hundreds of research projects, startups, and life decisions. Many who encountered him never forgot the encounter, even if it was brief. He had a way of making people feel their ideas were worth pursuing. Even as his fame grew, Marvin remained grounded. He didn't dress in suits or use lofty academic jargon to show off. His office was cluttered, his jokes were bad and frequent, and his tone was informal. But beneath the surface was a mind that operated at astonishing depth. What truly set Marvin apart as a teacher was his belief in potential. He never assumed intelligence was fixed or rare. Instead, he believed that most people were capable of incredible thought. They just needed the right kind of environment to explore it. He created such environments wherever he went. Through his teaching, Marvin Minsky did more than pass on knowledge. He built a legacy of thinkers who continued to shape the fields of technology, education, and philosophy. They carry with them his spirit of curiosity, his disregard for limits, and his belief that minds, whether silicon or human, are puzzles worth solving. Chapter 9. Reflections, Controversies, and Legacy Building. As Marvin Minsky entered the twilight of his career, he became increasingly reflective, not only about his own journey, but about the very nature of intelligence, technology, and the society shaping them. He continued to lecture and write, but his voice took on a deeper, more contemplative tone. Though his sharpness remained, there was a new softness in his musings, as if he had begun to grasp the enormity of what artificial intelligence could become and what it might never be. In these later years, Marvin did not slow down intellectually. He spent time refining the ideas laid out in his earlier work, particularly expanding upon the emotion machine. He explored how different layers of thought, reflexive, deliberative, reflective, interacted to produce human-like reasoning. To Minsky, this wasn't mere academic theorizing. He believed future intelligent systems would need to understand and replicate such processes if they were to move beyond calculation and into real cognition. But as AI gained traction in public consciousness, so too did debates around its ethics. Marvin, always a provocateur, sometimes clashed with newer voices in the field. While many were calling for strict safeguards around AI development, Minsky remained skeptical of alarmist narratives. He believed that media dramatization often distorted the real challenges. He argued that we should fear incompetence, not malevolence, that machines making dumb decisions with too much autonomy posed a greater threat than rogue superintelligences. Still, not all controversies stemmed from ideology. Late in his life, Minsky's name was drawn into a legal case tied to an infamous figure he had briefly known through professional networks. Though never charged with any wrongdoing and strenuously denying any implication, the situation brought unwanted attention and cast shadows during a time when his focus was elsewhere, on mentoring, writing, and thinking. Some in the AI community defended him publicly, noting that his life's work stood in stark contrast to the insinuations. But for Marvin, the moment was painful, a reminder that a lifetime of creation could still be vulnerable to distortion. Despite this, he remained a revered figure among many. At conferences, his presence still drew crowds. He was now a symbol of AI's origin story, someone who had walked with the founders, imagined the first dreams, and still dared to question where it was all going. Young researchers approached him with reverence. Many said speaking with him felt like connecting to the root of the tree they were now climbing. Minsky's reflections also turned to the philosophical. In interviews, he sometimes asked whether we had misunderstood intelligence all along. Maybe intelligence isn't about solving problems, he suggested in one talk. Maybe it's about asking new kinds of questions. He wondered aloud if our pursuit of artificial minds had blinded us to the complexity of our own. The brain, he often said, was a machine too, but one that carried the strange burden of self-awareness. He maintained friendships with thinkers far outside computer science. Musicians, novelists, mathematicians, cognitive scientists, they all found in Marvin a kindred spirit, someone who understood that thought wasn't confined to equations. He once spent an afternoon discussing Bach's fugues and the architecture of thought with a young composer, later musing that music might hold clues to how the mind handles recursion. Legacy was a topic Marvin treated with both seriousness and irony. He disliked the pomp of institutional tributes, preferring instead to see his ideas live on through action. "Don't name a building after me," he joked once. "Build a machine that can imagine a better one." Yet tributes poured in. Books were dedicated to him. An annual symposium at MIT began bearing his name, and students continued to build on the foundation he had helped lay, probing consciousness, pushing AI forward, wondering what makes minds tick. Minsky's later essays often combined technical speculation with deeply human insights. He seemed to be searching for unity, a way to explain not just cognition, but meaning. He asked whether the structures we built to simulate intelligence might one day give rise to something more, not only behavior, but experience, not only choice, but understanding. It was a question he never fully answered, though he never stopped chasing it. By the end of his life, Marvin had become something of a lodestar. He was not simply an engineer or a theorist, but a philosopher disguised as a scientist, a man who asked questions that would outlive him. He believed fervently in the potential of minds, whatever their origin, and though he never claimed to know where intelligence would lead us, he insisted the journey itself was worth the pursuit. Chapter 10. The Final Years and Enduring Influence. In his final years, Marvin Minsky remained intellectually restless. Even as age slowed his movements, it never touched the spark that had defined his thinking for nearly a century. Those closest to him often remarked that speaking with Marvin in his later days felt like flipping through a dozen books at once. One moment he'd dive into a technical theory, the next he'd reflect on a childhood memory, all tied together with a kind of whimsical clarity. He continued to visit MIT when he could, his presence still magnetic to students and faculty alike. Though his time in the lab was less frequent, he remained a fixture in intellectual circles, answering emails from curious minds, offering thoughts on emerging technologies, and mentoring younger thinkers whenever possible. His home became something of a salon where mathematicians, artists, and technologists gathered to explore the boundaries of thought, often over long dinners and longer conversations. Marvin's family, his wife Gloria, and their children remained central to his life. Gloria, a talented scientist and music enthusiast in her own right, had always been both companion and collaborator. Their shared love of music often echoed through their home, and Marvin took quiet joy in playing the piano even in his final years. His children, each accomplished in their fields, continued to bring ideas and stories that kept his mind engaged and his heart full. As his health began to decline, Marvin remained remarkably open about his mortality. He did not fear death in the way some might expect from a man so obsessed with the mechanics of the mind. To him, death was an unsolved problem, one that, if not cracked in his lifetime, might be addressed by others building on his work. He occasionally joked about cryonics and digital consciousness, half in seriousness, half in jest. But mostly, he seemed content to have played his part in the great experiment of understanding intelligence. In January 2016, Marvin Minsky passed away at the age of 88. The announcement sent waves across the global scientific community. Tributes flowed in from every corner of the world, from former students, fellow pioneers, and admirers in disciplines far beyond AI. Obituaries spoke of his achievements, his brilliance, his eccentricities, but those who knew him remembered something more personal, a man who treated every mind he encountered as a mystery worth unlocking. His death marked the end of an era. Minsky had stood at the genesis of artificial intelligence, seen it grow through winter and bloom, and helped shape its path through decades of transformation. His vision had stretched far beyond machines. He was, in many ways, trying to understand what made humans human. Today, his ideas live on in countless ways. The frameworks he developed inform AI systems around the world. His writings continue to challenge new generations of thinkers, and his students, now leaders in their own right, carry forward the spirit of inquiry he so deeply embodied. The Media Lab, the AI Lab, and many institutions influenced by him remain testaments to his vision that creativity, curiosity, and a refusal to accept limits are at the heart of true intelligence. Minsky's life also sparked reflection in popular culture. His appearances in documentaries, his influence on science fiction authors, and his philosophical provocations ensured that his legacy extended beyond technical circles. He had once advised filmmakers, challenged futurists, and inspired artists to rethink the relationship between humans and machines. Though the field he helped found has grown far beyond what he might have imagined in the 1950s, his fingerprints remain. Every time an AI system reasons through a problem, every time a student dares to ask an impossible question, Marvin's legacy echoes softly in the background. More than anything, Minsky's enduring influence lies in the idea that minds, whether biological or artificial, are not merely systems to be decoded, but wonders to be explored. He saw intelligence as a landscape without boundaries, and his life was a journey across its farthest horizons. In the quiet after his passing, one quote of his began to surface more frequently, shared in talks, books, and classrooms. You don't really understand something unless you can make it out of simple parts. It was as much a philosophy of thought as a guiding principle for a life spent unweaving the tapestry of the mind. And so the story of Marvin Minsky does not end with his death. It continues in the questions he inspired, the systems he dreamed of, and the minds he touched. A pioneer, a provocateur, and above all, a lifelong learner, Marvin Minsky's legacy is written not in monuments, but in minds still reaching toward understanding. Thanks for learning with Ku English. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Until next time.